December 3rd, 1944. A frozen field 5 miles west of the Roer River, Germany. Corporal James Mitchell of the 2nd Armored Division watched through binoculars as 3 German soldiers emerged from a tree line, hands raised, walking slowly toward American positions. Standard surrender. Mitchell had seen dozens in the past month as German resistance crumbled, but something about these 3 looked wrong. They weren't retreating from a firefight. No artillery was falling, no American attack was happening. They were walking straight toward American lines from a position they could have easily defended. Mitchell lowered his binoculars as the Germans reached the perimeter. One of them, a Wehrmacht Gefreiter with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, spoke broken English. "We come to America camp. We hear food. Medicine. We hear Geneva." Mitchell glanced at the German's uniform. It was filthy but intact. The soldier wasn't wounded. His companions weren't either. They had walked away from their unit, deliberately seeking capture, not because they'd been defeated in combat, but because they'd heard something that made surrender preferable to continuing to fight for Germany. What Mitchell was witnessing, and what American intelligence officers would document in hundreds of interrogation reports through winter 1944-45, was a phenomenon that contradicted everything about military honor and national loyalty. German soldiers were choosing to surrender to American forces, not because they'd been defeated on the battlefield, but because word had spread through Wehrmacht ranks that American POW camps offered something the collapsing German military could no longer provide: food, shelter, medical care, and the promise of survival. The propaganda war had been won not through radio broadcasts or leaflets, but through the simple, verified reports of German POWs who wrote letters home, describing meals with meat, bread, and desserts, while their former comrades starved on rations below 1,500 calories per day. The interrogation tent smelled of canvas and damp wool. Captain Robert Chen of G2 Intelligence sat across a folding table from the Wehrmacht Gefreiter, who'd walked into American lines 3 hours earlier. The German's name was Friedrich Müller. His uniform bore the insignia of 116th Panzer Division. He was 23 years old and didn't look like he'd eaten a proper meal in weeks. Chen opened his notebook. "Why did you surrender today?" Müller answered in broken English. "We hear about America camps. Letters from soldiers. They say food is good. Medicine. They say Geneva." Chen had heard similar statements from other prisoners, but Müller's case was different. The German had walked away from a defensive position that American forces weren't even attacking. He'd abandoned his post voluntarily, deliberately seeking capture rather than waiting to be defeated in combat. "What letters?" Chen asked. Müller explained haltingly. His cousin had been captured in Italy in 1943-6. Months later, a letter arrived at Müller's family home in Bavaria. The cousin described his POW camp in Texas. 3 meals daily. Meat, bread, vegetables. A bed with mattress and blankets. Medical treatment when he'd fallen ill. The letter mentioned Geneva Convention multiple times. Americans followed the rules, treated prisoners as the treaty required. Other letters had circulated through Müller's unit. Men who'd been captured and sent to American camps wrote home describing conditions that seemed impossible. One letter described Christmas dinner in 1943, roasted chicken, potatoes, cake. Another mentioned educational classes, permission to form sports teams, even wages for work performed. The accounts were consistent enough to be credible. These weren't propaganda leaflets promising impossible things. These were letters from known soldiers describing actual experiences. Chen made notes. He'd been conducting interrogations for 8 months and the pattern was becoming clear. German soldiers weren't just surrendering when defeated militarily. Some were actively choosing to become American prisoners because they'd learned that life as a POW exceeded life as a Wehrmacht soldier in late 1944. Lieutenant James Walsh entered the tent with the other 2 Germans from Müller's group. One was Obergefreiter Hans Schneider, age 28. The other was Schütze Otto Weber, 19 years old. Both told essentially the same story. They'd heard about American camps. They knew German frontline rations had been cut to starvation levels, maybe 2,500 to 1,500 calories daily, mostly black bread and thin soup. They knew the war was lost, and they knew that surrendering to Americans offered better survival prospects than continuing to fight. Chen asked the critical question: how widespread is this? Are other soldiers planning to surrender? Mueller nodded. Many talk about it, not officers. They still believe or they are afraid. But soldiers, we know the war is finished. Better to survive in America camp than die here for nothing. The interrogation continued for another hour. Chen documented everything: the letters the Germans had seen, the rumors circulating through Wehrmacht units, the calculations soldiers were making about when and how to surrender. The information was tactically valuable but strategically troubling. American POW treatment was becoming psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda campaign. After the Germans were escorted to a collection point, Chen reviewed his notes. The 1929 Geneva Convention required that POWs receive the same rations as the holding power's troops. For American forces, that meant approximately 3,200 calories daily: meat, bread, fresh vegetables, butter, occasional desserts. The U.S. Army could afford generous rations because American agricultural production vastly exceeded domestic and military needs. But the abundance that made Geneva Convention compliance easy for America created unintended consequence. German soldiers were learning through verified sources, letters from fellow POWs, that American camps provided better living conditions than the collapsing Wehrmacht could offer its own troops. The information was spreading through informal networks that German military censorship couldn't fully control. Chen drafted his intelligence summary for regimental headquarters. The voluntary surrenders weren't isolated incidents. Other units were reporting similar patterns. German soldiers walking into American lines without combat pressure. Prisoners explaining they'd heard about camp conditions through letters and rumors. Wehrmacht morale collapsing not just from battlefield defeats, but from rational calculation that surrender offered better survival than continued fighting. The summary raised uncomfortable questions. Should American forces exploit this information actively, perhaps by distributing leaflets quoting actual POW letters? Or would that constitute illegal enticement to surrender, violating laws of war that prohibited inducing enemy soldiers to abandon their duties? Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, but didn't explicitly authorize using that treatment as psychological warfare tool. By evening, Chen's report reached Division Intelligence. Similar reports were arriving from other sectors. The pattern was clear and widespread. German frontline units in December 1944 were experiencing morale crisis, driven partly by battlefield defeats but significantly by knowledge, verified through POW letters, that American captivity offered warmth, food, medical care, and reasonable prospects of surviving the war. The psychological warfare was unintentional but devastatingly effective. America hadn't designed POW policy to encourage surrenders. Geneva Convention compliance reflected legal obligations and humanitarian principles. But the policy's effects on enemy morale exceeded what deliberate propaganda could achieve. German soldiers trusted letters from fellow prisoners more than they trusted any official source. And those letters described a reality that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American brutality while offering alternative to starvation and pointless death in lost war. The voluntary surrenders would continue through winter and spring 1945, eventually contributing to Wehrmacht's collapse as millions of German soldiers chose American captivity over Soviet revenge, or continued fighting for a regime that could no longer feed them. The weapon that helped win this aspect of the war wasn't bombs or bullets. It was simply treating enemies as human beings and allowing that truth to spread through the most credible source available: the verified testimony of men who'd experienced it firsthand. The letter arrived at the Müller family home in Augsburg on March 18, 1944. Frau Anna Müller recognized her nephew's handwriting immediately. Karl Müller had been captured by American forces during the retreat from Kasserine Pass in Tunisia 14 months earlier. The family had received official notification from the Wehrmacht that he was alive and held as prisoner of war. But this was the first direct word they'd received about his actual conditions. Anna opened the letter carefully. Carl described his journey from North Africa to a camp called Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He'd expected harsh treatment. Nazi propaganda had prepared German soldiers to fear American captivity, torture, starvation, brutal labor under inhuman conditions. The propaganda ministry distributed photographs purportedly showing emaciated German POWs, accompanied by stories of Allied atrocities. But Carl's letter described something entirely different. He wrote about the train ride from the port to the camp. Armed guards, but no beatings. boxcars with ventilation, stops for water and food. He described arriving at Fort Sam Houston and receiving a medical examination. A doctor had treated an infected wound on his leg that Wehrmacht medical services had ignored for weeks. He'd been given clean clothing, assigned a bunk in a heated barracks, and provided with blankets and a mattress. The food was what astonished him most. Karl's letter devoted an entire paragraph to describing his first meal as American prisoner. Bread that was actually white, not the coarse black bread German soldiers received. Meat, beef, real beef, not horse meat or mystery protein from field kitchens. Boiled potatoes with butter, vegetables, coffee with sugar. The portions were generous. He estimated he'd eaten more at that single meal than he typically consumed in 2 days on Wehrmacht rations. Karl mentioned the Geneva Convention repeatedly. American guards explained that prisoners would receive the same food as American soldiers, the same housing, the same medical care. They would be paid small wages for work performed. They could write letters home. They could form sports teams, attend religious services, access educational materials. The Americans followed the rules, Karl wrote. They treated prisoners as soldiers, not criminals. Anna Müller read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. Her son Friedrich was serving with 116th Panzer Division on the Eastern Front. She would write to him immediately. She would tell him what his cousin had described. If Friedrich ever faced capture, he should know that surrendering to Americans offered survival. The letter wasn't unique. By summer 1944, thousands of German POWs held in American camps were writing similar accounts. The U.S. military censored correspondence to prevent transmission of military intelligence, but didn't suppress descriptions of camp conditions. American authorities wanted German families to know how POWs were treated. It aligned with stated commitment to Geneva Convention and offered propaganda advantage over Nazi brutality. The letters circulated through informal networks Nazi censors couldn't fully control. Soldiers on leave read them. Family members shared them, with neighbors whose sons served in Wehrmacht. The accounts were remarkably consistent. American camps provided warmth, food, medical care, humane treatment. The consistency made them credible in ways official propaganda never achieved. Wehrmacht soldiers receiving these letters faced cognitive dissonance. Nazi ideology taught that Americans were mongrel race, incapable of matching German military prowess. Propaganda depicted them as weak, decadent, controlled by Jewish interests. But letters from fellow soldiers, men they knew personally whose word they trusted, described Americans as powerful, organized, and surprisingly humane toward defeated enemies. The contradiction between propaganda and verified reality created cracks in ideological certainty. If Nazi claims about American brutality were false, what else might be lies? If German POWs in American camps ate better than Wehrmacht soldiers on the front, what did that say about German military supply systems? If Americans followed Geneva Convention while German rations fell below survival levels, which side was winning the logistics war? By late 1944, as German supply networks collapsed under Allied bombing and territorial losses, frontline rations fell to starvation levels. Soldiers received 1,200 to 1,500 calories daily, mostly black bread and thin soup made from potatoes and turnips. Meat became rare. Butter disappeared. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 could barely feed its troops by winter 1944. The letters from American camps created stark comparison. POWs described meals totaling 3,000 calories. They mentioned Christmas dinner 1943, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pie. They wrote about gaining weight in captivity after years of marginal nutrition in Wehrmacht service. Some mentioned American guards sharing cigarettes, offering coffee, treating them with unexpected decency. Wehrmacht morale suffered accordingly. Soldiers facing certain defeat, starvation rations, and brutal winter conditions began calculating rational survival strategies. Continuing to fight meant probable death from combat, disease, or malnutrition. Surrendering to Americans meant verified prospects of adequate food, medical care, and surviving the war. The choice wasn't about ideology or honor, it was mathematics of survival. Nazi commanders recognized the danger. Some units forbade discussion of American camp conditions. Officers threatened soldiers caught reading letters describing POW treatment. But the information spread regardless through informal networks that military discipline couldn't suppress. Soldiers trusted fellow soldiers more than they trusted officers repeating increasingly implausible propaganda. The psychological impact exceeded what deliberate propaganda campaigns could achieve. American leaflets dropped over German lines promised fair treatment, but soldiers dismissed them as lies. Letters from fellow POWs describing personal experiences carried credibility no official source could match. The Americans hadn't designed their POW policy to encourage surrenders. Geneva Convention compliance reflected legal obligations. But the unintended strategic effect was devastating to German morale. By December 1944, when Friedrich Müller walked into American lines west of the Roer River, he'd already read his cousin Karl's letters describing life in Texas POW camp. He knew what awaited him. He knew American captivity offered better survival prospects than continuing to fight for a regime that could neither feed nor protect its soldiers. The decision to surrender wasn't betrayal. It was rational choice informed by verified information that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had promised. And as winter deepened and German rations fell further, thousands more would make the same calculation. The mathematics of hunger were brutally simple. A human body performing active military service required approximately 3,000 calories daily to maintain weight, strength, and combat effectiveness. By November 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Western Front were receiving between 1,200 and 1,500 calories per day. The deficit, 1,500 calories daily, meant systematic starvation. Soldiers were burning muscle tissue and organ mass to fuel basic metabolism. The body consumed itself. Gefreiter Hans Weber ate breakfast on December 2, 1944. The meal consisted of one slice of black bread, coarse rye flour mixed with sawdust and potato starch to extend supply. The bread weighed approximately 50 grams. It provided maybe 120 calories. With it came ersatz coffee, roasted acorns ground and steeped in hot water. No sugar, no milk. The coffee provided warmth but negligible nutrition. Lunch was soup. Wehrmacht field kitchens produced it from whatever remained available: turnips, cabbage, potatoes, when logistics permitted. Weber's portion filled a standard mess tin, approximately 250 milliliters. The liquid was mostly water. Vegetable matter floated suspended. Turnip fragments, cabbage leaves softened by boiling. If he was fortunate, a piece of potato. The soup provided perhaps 150 calories. Dinner replicated breakfast, another slice of black bread, more acorn coffee. Some days included small portions of margarine or ersatz jam made from beets. Rarely soldiers received sausage, maybe 30 grams weekly when supply lines functioned. The Wehrmacht ration that had sustained conquering armies in 1940 had collapsed to subsistence levels that guaranteed slow starvation. Weber calculated his daily intake, 400 to 500 calories maximum. He'd been eating at this level for 6 weeks. He'd lost perhaps 15 kilograms from a frame that had never carried excess weight. His uniform hung loose. His belt, notched to its final hole, no longer held his trousers properly. He felt perpetually cold, the body's metabolism slowing to conserve energy. Wounds healed slowly or not at all. Minor infections became dangerous as immune function degraded, under malnutrition. The comparison with American POW camps was stark and mathematical. Weber had read his brother's letter describing Camp Hearn in Texas. The letter included details that seemed impossible. Breakfast: oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream. Lunch: meat, actual meat, not sausage scraps, with vegetables, potatoes, bread, dessert. Dinner: more meat, more vegetables, soup, bread, coffee. The 1929 Geneva Convention required that POWs receive the same rations as the holding power's troops. American soldiers ate well, approximately 3,200 calories daily. German POWs in American camps received identical meals. The contrast wasn't slight, it was existential. Weber was starving on 400 calories, while German POWs in Texas consumed 8 times that amount. They ate more in a single American meal than he consumed in 3 days. The calorie gap represented more than nutrition. It revealed industrial capacity translated into human survival. American agricultural production vastly exceeded domestic needs. The United States produced enough food to feed its civilian population, its military forces, allied armies, and millions of POWs simultaneously. American abundance made Geneva Convention compliance affordable, even easy. Germany faced opposite reality. Allied bombing had disrupted logistics networks that moved food from agricultural regions to army units. Territorial losses cut access to breadbasket regions that had fed Wehrmacht soldiers. Romanian oil fields, Ukrainian grain, French agriculture all lost. German domestic production couldn't feed both civilians and military. When choices had to be made, soldiers received priority. But that priority still meant starvation rations, because the food simply didn't exist. Weber understood the arithmetic. He was losing weight systematically. His body was cannibalizing itself. In 6 months at current ration levels, malnutrition would render him combat ineffective. In 12 months, he would likely be dead from starvation-related disease. Those were the numbers if he continued fighting for Germany. Alternatively, he could walk into American lines. Surrender meant immediate access to the same 3,200-calorie diet American soldiers received. It meant warmth, medical care, survival. The calculation wasn't complex. It was mathematics determining whether he lived or died. The perverse incentive created by the calorie gap was undermining Wehrmacht cohesion from within. Soldiers facing certain defeat and probable starvation had rational self-interest in seeking capture. Military discipline required continuing to fight regardless of personal survival prospects. But when regime could neither win the war nor feed its soldiers, discipline competed against biological imperatives, driving human behavior at fundamental level. Wehrmacht officers recognized the morale crisis. Some threatened soldiers caught discussing American camp conditions. Others confiscated letters describing POW treatment. But hunger wasn't an ideological position that could be suppressed through discipline. It was biological fact evident in every soldier's emaciated frame, every belt notched tighter, every uniform hanging loose on wasting bodies. By December 1944, the calorie gap had become a strategic weapon neither side intended to deploy. America hadn't designed generous POW rations to encourage surrenders. Geneva Convention required it. Germany hadn't chosen to starve its soldiers. Circumstances forced it. But the result was mathematical calculation spreading through Wehrmacht ranks. Capture by Americans meant survival. Continued fighting meant probable death from causes that had nothing to do with American combat effectiveness and everything to do with Germany's collapsed logistics. The letters from American camps included one detail that haunted frontline soldiers more than any other. German POWs were gaining weight in captivity. Men who'd been emaciated from years of marginal Wehrmacht rations were adding 25, 30, even 50 pounds eating American food. The image of well-fed German prisoners contrasted with reality of starving German soldiers created cognitive dissonance that no amount of Nazi propaganda could resolve. And as winter deepened and German rations fell further still, as Allied bombing continued destroying logistics, as territorial losses continued shrinking agricultural access, the mathematics of survival would drive thousands more toward the same rational calculation that had brought Friedrich Müller walking into American lines west of the Roer River. The document that would shape Friedrich Müller's fate had been signed 15 years before he surrendered. On July 27, 1929, diplomats from 47 nations gathered in Geneva, Switzerland, to finalize the convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The treaty ran to 97 articles covering every aspect of POW treatment: housing, food, medical care, discipline, labor, correspondence, and repatriation. Article 11 was explicit about nutrition. Food rations for prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the depot troops. The language meant POWs must receive the same meals as the captor nation's own soldiers in base camps, not frontline combat rations, but the standard meals provided to troops in training or support roles. Article 12 added that prisoners could not be denied food as punishment, and that camps must operate canteens selling local products. The treaty's authors in 1929 couldn't have foreseen how industrial capacity would determine which signatories could afford compliance. For the United States in 1944, providing POWs with American military rations was logistically and economically feasible. American agricultural production vastly exceeded domestic consumption. The nation produced approximately 120 million tons of grain annually, 10 billion pounds of meat, millions of tons of vegetables, and fruit. American farmers fed 140 million American civilians, 12 million American military personnel, substantial portions of Allied armies, and ultimately over 425,000 German POWs, all simultaneously. The abundance made Geneva Convention compliance straightforward. U.S. military rations in 1944 totaled 3,200 calories daily, including meat, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, sugar, occasional desserts. Providing identical meals to German POWs cost money, but didn't strain resources. The United States could afford to be generous. Germany faced opposite circumstances. By 1944, Allied bombing had destroyed transportation networks that moved food from farms to cities and military units. Territorial losses cut access to agricultural regions that had sustained Wehrmacht forces, Ukrainian grain, Romanian resources, French production. German domestic agriculture alone couldn't feed both civilians and millions of military personnel. When regime had to choose, soldiers received priority. But that priority still meant inadequate nutrition because the food didn't exist in sufficient quantity. German POW camps holding American prisoners reflected this scarcity. Early in the war, when Germany still controlled agricultural regions across Europe, American POWs received treatment approaching Geneva Convention standards. By 1944, as resources collapsed, conditions deteriorated. American prisoners faced declining rations, not from deliberate cruelty, but from German inability to feed anyone adequately. The Wehrmacht couldn't provide its own soldiers with sufficient calories. It certainly couldn't provide better treatment to enemy prisoners. The asymmetry created paradox. German POWs in American camps ate better than German soldiers on German front lines. American POWs in German camps faced declining conditions that still exceeded what German civilians received. Geneva Convention had created legal framework for humane treatment, but compliance depended entirely on captor nations' resources. Soviet Union added darker dimension. The USSR hadn't signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. Joseph Stalin refused to acknowledge international law, constraining how Soviet forces treated captured enemies. German soldiers who surrendered to Red Army faced brutal captivity, starvation, forced labor, systematic mistreatment, probable death. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviets during W3, over 1 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, and abuse. The death rate approached 35%. The contrast between American and Soviet POW treatment drove German strategic calculations by late 1944. Wehrmacht soldiers facing defeat had strong incentive to surrender westward toward American lines rather than eastward toward Soviets. The preference wasn't about ideology. It was rational survival strategy based on verified knowledge about captor nations' treatment of prisoners. American compliance with Geneva Convention became unintended strategic advantage. Humane POW treatment enhanced U.S. moral position internationally. It encouraged enemy surrenders by creating incentive structure where capture by Americans offered better prospects than continued fighting or capture by Soviets. And it demonstrated that liberal democracies could wage total war without abandoning civilized standards codified in international law. But the advantage existed only because American resources made compliance affordable. The moral high ground was partly genuine humanitarian principle. American commitment to Geneva Convention reflected cultural values about human dignity and rule of law. But it was also partly privilege of abundance. United States could afford to feed millions of POWs generously because American agricultural capacity exceeded what was necessary to sustain the war effort. The moral principle and economic capacity were inseparable. Germany couldn't match American POW treatment not because German values were fundamentally different, but because German resources couldn't support equivalent compliance. A nation that couldn't adequately feed its own soldiers obviously couldn't provide enemy prisoners with 3,000-calorie meals. The Geneva Convention established legal obligation, but industrial and agricultural capacity determined whether signatories could fulfill it. The treaty's impact on German morale was devastating precisely because it created verifiable information channel about treatment differences. German soldiers received letters from POWs in American camps describing generous food, medical care, humane conditions. Those letters contrasted sharply with German soldiers' personal experiences of starvation rations and collapsing logistics. The comparison wasn't propaganda, it was documented reality that soldiers could verify through trusted sources. By December 1944, Geneva Convention had become psychological warfare tool, despite never being designed for that purpose. The treaty was written to protect POWs from mistreatment. Its authors intended humanitarian safeguards, not strategic weapons. But when one belligerent could afford generous compliance while its enemy could barely feed its own army, the treaty's requirements became force multiplier, encouraging surrenders through simple truth about treatment differences. Friedrich Müller, walking into American lines west of the Roer River, made rational calculation based on verified information. He knew Geneva Convention required Americans to provide same food their own troops received. He knew from letters that American troops ate well. He knew Wehrmacht could no longer feed German soldiers adequately. The choice between continued fighting and American captivity wasn't about honor or loyalty. It was about survival informed by international treaty that one side could afford to follow and the other couldn't. And as German resources continued collapsing through winter 1945, that calculation would drive millions more toward American lines, seeking the protection of treaties signed 16 years earlier by diplomats who couldn't have imagined how industrial capacity would determine which promises could be kept. By January 1945, German forces occupied shrinking territory between two converging armies. From the east, Soviet Red Army advanced through Poland toward German borders, taking vengeance for Operation Barbarossa that had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. From the west, American and British forces pushed through Rhineland toward Germany's industrial heartland. Wehrmacht units caught between these pincers faced choices that would determine whether they lived or died. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. Surrendering to Soviets meant probable death. Soviet treatment of German prisoners reflected justified rage over Nazi atrocities in occupied territories. Red Army soldiers had witnessed burned villages, mass graves, systematic extermination. They had lost families, homes, entire communities to Wehrmacht invasion. Mercy toward captured Germans was not priority. German soldiers knew this. They'd heard stories from Eastern Front. Prisoners marched without food or water until they collapsed. Forced labor in conditions designed to kill. Systematic mistreatment as revenge for German crimes. Statistics confirmed their fears. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviets during Dubas-Babiaki, over 1 million died in captivity. The death rate approached 35%. Surviving German POWs faced years of forced labor in Soviet camps, often not returning home until the 1950s. Some never returned. Surrendering to Americans offered dramatically different prospects. German soldiers had verified information, letters from POWs describing 3,000-calorie meals, medical care, Geneva Convention treatment. American captivity meant survival. Soviet captivity meant probable death. The calculation was simple. Wehrmacht units responded accordingly. When possible, they maneuvered westward. Divisions that could have established defensive positions against American advances instead withdrew toward American lines, deliberately seeking capture by U.S. forces rather than Soviets. The preference became explicit policy at unit level, even when contradicting orders from Berlin to defend every meter of German soil. In March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and encircled the Ruhr industrial region, entire German divisions surrendered en masse. The Ruhr pocket trapped over 300,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, Army Group B with 7 corps and 19 divisions. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the pocket, faced Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. His soldiers faced different reality. They were surrounded by Americans, not Soviets. Surrender meant survival. The pocket collapsed in 18 days. By April 18th, over 317,000 German soldiers had surrendered to American forces. It was the largest German capitulation on the Western Front. Model himself committed suicide rather than face capture, but his troops chose life over ideology. They walked into American lines by the thousands, sometimes entire battalions arriving together with officers leading their men into captivity. The pattern repeated across Western Front through April and May 1945. As Soviet forces approached Berlin from the east, Wehrmacht units in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and southern Germany moved westward when operationally feasible. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed leadership after Hitler's suicide, authorized general withdrawal toward American and British lines. On May 4th, German forces in northern Germany, Denmark, and Netherlands, over 1 million troops, surrendered to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The final days of the war became race westward. German units fleeing Soviet advance sought to cross into American-controlled territory. Civilian refugees joined the flow. Millions of Germans fleeing Red Army revenge. Roads jammed with Wehrmacht soldiers, SS units, civilians, all moving west toward American lines. The columns stretched for miles, visible from air as human rivers flowing away from Soviet advance. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, American and British forces held over 5 million German POWs. Soviet forces held approximately 3 million. The disparity reflected German soldiers' calculated choices about where to surrender. Given the option, Wehrmacht troops overwhelmingly chose American captivity over Soviet vengeance. But the flood of surrenders created crisis. American forces hadn't anticipated. Planning assumed capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The reality was millions. By March 1945, so many Germans were surrendering that Allied logistics couldn't handle the volume. Shipping to transport POWs to camps in the United States was fully allocated. Processing facilities were overwhelmed. American forces faced millions of prisoners with nowhere to put them. Improvised solutions violated the Geneva Convention standards Americans claimed to uphold. Prisoners were held in open fields surrounded by barbed wire, the Rheinwiesenlager or Rhine meadow camps. Guards were minimal. Shelter was non-existent. Medical care was inadequate. Food supplies struggled to meet demand. The conditions weren't deliberate cruelty, they were logistical failure under unexpected circumstances. But German POWs who'd surrendered expecting Geneva Convention treatment instead found themselves confined in muddy fields with minimal provisions. The contradiction between promised treatment and actual conditions created moral complexity. American forces had genuinely intended to follow Geneva Convention. The reputation for humane treatment was deserved based on earlier POW experiences. But military logistics couldn't scale fast enough when millions surrendered simultaneously. The system designed to handle hundreds of thousands collapsed under millions. Some German prisoners died in Rhine meadow camps from disease, exposure, and malnutrition during spring 1945. The numbers remain disputed. Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands, depending on source and methodology. Whatever the actual total, the deaths represented failure to maintain standards that had encouraged the surrenders in the first place. By summer 1945, conditions improved as American forces established more permanent camps, and logistics caught up with demand. But the spring crisis revealed uncomfortable truth. The moral high ground that had encouraged German surrenders depended on resources to support humane treatment at scale. When millions surrendered simultaneously, even nations genuinely committed to Geneva Convention struggled to maintain standards under operational chaos of war's final weeks. The westward flow of German soldiers in spring 1945 represented rational calculation, overwhelming ideological loyalty. Wehrmacht troops chose survival over continued fighting for lost cause. They chose American captivity over Soviet revenge. The mass surrenders contributed to Nazi Germany's collapse as fighting forces dissolved through voluntary capitulation rather than destruction in combat. But the surrenders also created conditions where promises about treatment couldn't always be fulfilled, demonstrating that moral principles required not just good intentions, but operational capacity to implement them when millions of desperate men sought simultaneously the mercy that earlier prisoners had verified through letters home. Camp Hearn sat in the flat agricultural landscape of central Texas, 40 miles northwest of Houston. The facility opened in September 1942 and eventually held over 5,000 German prisoners of war. Karl Müller arrived there in March 1944 after being captured in Tunisia, expecting the brutal conditions Nazi propaganda had promised. What he found instead was a small American town made of tar paper barracks, enclosed by chain-link fence and guard towers. The barracks had wooden floors, walls, roofs. Each prisoner received a bunk with mattress, blankets, pillow. The buildings had electric lighting. Heating stoves provided warmth during Texas winters. Latrines had running water and flush toilets. Medical facilities offered treatment by German doctors, supervised by American medical staff. The accommodations exceeded what Müller had experienced during his years in the Wehrmacht. But the food was what astonished him most. Breakfast arrived at 0700 hours. Oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs cooked with actual butter, bacon strips, toast with jam, coffee with cream and sugar. The portions were generous. Müller ate until he felt full for the first time in months. Lunch at noon brought meat, real beef, not sausage scraps, with vegetables, potatoes, bread, butter. Dinner at 1800 replicated lunch with different preparations. Between meals, a canteen sold candy, cigarettes, soft drinks using wages prisoners earned from work assignments. Müller was assigned to agricultural labor on a local cotton farm. The work was supervised but not harsh. American guards transported prisoners to fields each morning and returned them to camp each evening. The work paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. Not real money, but enough to purchase items from the canteen. Other prisoners worked in camp kitchens, laundries, and maintenance. The labor was productive but governed by Geneva Convention restrictions that prevented forced work in war industries. Recreation opportunities exceeded Müller's expectations. The camp had sports fields where prisoners organized soccer leagues. They formed musical groups, orchestras, choirs, jazz bands that performed for fellow prisoners and occasionally for local civilian audiences. Educational programs offered courses in English, mathematics, vocational skills. A camp library contained German and English books. Prisoners published camp newspapers with articles, poetry, drawings. By 1945, over 370,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States. The facilities scattered through Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and dozens of other states. The locations were deliberately remote. Escape was impractical when the nearest German territory lay across 3,000 miles of ocean. But the remoteness also meant camps existed in rural American communities, where many residents had German ancestry and often spoke German at home. Local interactions were surprisingly positive. Farmers who employed POW labor generally treated them well. Some prisoners received invitations to family dinners. In towns with German immigrant populations, civilians engaged prisoners in conversation, offered cigarettes, treated them as human beings rather than enemies. The connections reflected complex reality. Many German Americans maintained cultural ties to Germany, while remaining loyal American citizens who sent their own sons to fight in U.S. military. For prisoners like Karl Müller, the experience contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught about America. He'd been told Americans were weak, decadent, racially impure. Instead, he found a nation wealthy enough to feed millions of POWs generously while waging global war. He'd been told American culture was inferior. Instead, he encountered technological sophistication, industrial capacity, and social organization that exceeded anything he'd witnessed in Germany. Some prisoners responded to the experience by questioning Nazi ideology. The American Re-Education Program, implemented in 1944, offered classes covering democratic principles, accurate history of the war, evidence of Nazi crimes. Not all prisoners accepted the information. Hardcore Nazis within camps sometimes intimidated or attacked prisoners who embraced democratic ideas. But many recognized that Nazi propaganda had been systematically false about American society, military capability, and moral character. Post-war, some German POWs chose to return to the United States as immigrants. They'd formed connections with American families. They'd learned English. They'd seen opportunities that war-devastated Germany couldn't offer. The numbers weren't massive. Immigration restrictions limited how many could return. But the fact that any chose to emigrate to nation they'd fought against demonstrated how profoundly the POW experience had altered their perspectives. The paradox of American POW policy was that genuine humanitarian principles and strategic calculation were inseparable. The United States followed Geneva Convention partly from moral commitment to rule of law and human dignity. But the policy also served strategic interests. Humane treatment encouraged enemy surrenders, demonstrated American moral superiority, and validated claims that democracies fought wars without abandoning civilized standards. The two motivations reinforced each other, making it impossible to separate altruism from advantage. But the generous treatment of German POWs highlighted uncomfortable contrasts in American wartime policies. While German prisoners ate 3,000-calorie meals, Japanese American citizens were confined in internment camps, detained without trial based solely on ancestry. The internment camps weren't POW facilities. Japanese Americans weren't enemy prisoners, they were American citizens. Yet their treatment often fell below standards extended to German POWs. The racial dimension was undeniable. German prisoners received Geneva Convention protections partially because Americans viewed Germans as culturally and racially similar despite being enemies. Japanese opponents faced harsher treatment both as POWs and when American citizens of Japanese descent were interned. The selective application of humanitarian principles revealed that wartime policies reflected not just legal obligations but racial perceptions that determined who received protection of civilized standards. African American soldiers who guarded German POW camps faced their own paradox. They ensured that German prisoners who'd fought for racist Nazi regime received better treatment than many Black Americans experienced in their own country. German POWs could eat in restaurants that excluded Black soldiers. They could access facilities that segregation denied to African American troops guarding them. The contradiction exposed how American claims about fighting for freedom and democracy coexisted with domestic racial oppression that denied those principles to millions of American citizens. Carl Miller gained weight in Camp Hearn. He added 30 pounds eating American food after years of marginal Wehrmacht rations. He learned English. He read American newspapers. He watched American guards treat him humanely despite his role fighting against them. When he wrote letters home describing his experience, he included details about meals, recreation, humane treatment. Those letters reached Germany and circulated through Wehrmacht units, creating information that would eventually bring his cousin Friedrich walking into American lines west of the Roer River in December 1944. The cycle of verified information continued. Each POW describing actual experiences created knowledge that drove more surrenders, which created more POWs who sent more letters confirming the pattern. The weapon wasn't propaganda. It was simply truth about how one side treated captured enemies when resources allowed compliance with humanitarian standards that the other side couldn't afford to match. 75 years after Friedrich Müller walked into American lines west of the Roer River, military historians examining factors that contributed to Nazi Germany's collapse recognized a weapon the Allies had deployed without intending it as such. American treatment of German prisoners of war had undermined Wehrmacht morale, encouraged mass surrenders, and demonstrated that democracies could wage total war without abandoning civilized principles. The weapon wasn't bullets or bombs, it was decency. The policy succeeded because it aligned genuine humanitarian commitment with strategic interests. The United States followed the 1929 Geneva Convention partly from moral obligation. American culture valued rule of law and human dignity even toward enemies. But humane POW treatment also served strategic purposes. It encouraged surrenders by creating incentive structure where capture offered better prospects than continued fighting. It demonstrated moral superiority over Nazi brutality, and it saved Allied lives by reducing German soldiers' motivation to fight to the death. The psychological warfare required no deception. American forces didn't exaggerate conditions in POW camps. They simply followed Geneva Convention requirements and allowed truth to spread through most credible channel available, letters from German POWs describing actual experiences. When Carl Miller wrote home from Camp Hearn describing 3,000-calorie meals and humane treatment, he wasn't repeating propaganda. He was documenting reality. That truth, spreading through Wehrmacht units via trusted sources, proved more effective than any leaflet campaign could achieve. German soldiers' rational choice to surrender when facing defeat reflected how treating enemies humanely served victors' interests. Every German who surrendered meant one less enemy resisting Allied advances. Mass surrenders in spring 1945, over 5 million German soldiers choosing American captivity, accelerated Nazi collapse more effectively than additional combat could have accomplished. The surrender saved Allied lives that would have been lost destroying German units through continued fighting. And they validated American claims that democratic values weren't abandoned under pressure of total war. The legacy revealed deeper truth about armed conflict. Armies that maintained civilized standards even toward enemies gained strategic advantages through moral authority. Humane treatment encouraged defections and undermined enemy cohesion. It demonstrated that victory didn't require matching enemy brutality. Sometimes the most effective weapon was simply treating human beings as human beings, deserving basic dignity regardless of which side they'd fought for. The principle extended beyond Wehrmacht. Cold War propaganda emphasized how Western democracies treated individuals compared to Soviet bloc oppression. American emphasis on human rights and rule of law became a strategic asset in ideological competition. The contrast between democratic and authoritarian treatment of people, including enemies, influenced global perceptions and encouraged defections from communist states throughout the Cold War. The lesson from German POW treatment in Wehrmacht was that moral principles could serve strategic interests when consistently applied. But the success depended critically on resources to support humane treatment at scale. American POW policy worked because American industrial and agricultural capacity made generous treatment affordable. The United States produced enough food to feed 140 million civilians, 12 million military personnel, substantial Allied forces, and over 400,000 POWs simultaneously. Geneva Convention compliance didn't strain American resources. It was well within capacity of the world's largest economy, operating at wartime production levels. The privilege of abundance allowed compliance with principles that resource-constrained powers couldn't match. Germany couldn't provide enemy prisoners with 3,000-calorie meals when Wehrmacht soldiers were starving on 1,500 calories. Soviet Union, devastated by Nazi invasion that killed 27 million citizens, couldn't afford mercy toward captured Germans who'd participated in that destruction. The moral high ground America occupied was partly genuine principle but also partly privilege of economic superiority. The distinction mattered for understanding military effectiveness. Superior outcomes derived not just from better equipment or superior training, but from economic capacity that allowed humane treatment of millions of prisoners while maintaining combat operations globally. Industrial might translated into moral authority when nations wealthy enough to be generous demonstrated that wealth through actions toward defeated enemies. The most powerful propaganda, history demonstrated, was simply truth about conditions that exceeded enemy expectations. German soldiers didn't surrender because American leaflets promised good treatment. They dismissed such promises as lies. They surrendered because fellow soldiers' letters verified that American camps provided food, shelter, medical care, and survival prospects vastly better than Wehrmacht could offer. The propaganda was truth, and truth was believable because it came from trusted sources documenting actual experiences. The weapon of decency had limitations that became evident in spring 1945 when millions surrendered simultaneously. American logistics couldn't immediately process that volume. Rhine Meadow camps held prisoners in conditions violating Geneva Convention standards Americans claimed to uphold. The failure wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was operational breakdown under unexpected circumstances. But it demonstrated that moral principles required not just good intentions, but capacity to implement them when tested by scale. Yet, despite temporary failures under extreme conditions, American POW treatment overall achieved strategic objectives through humane methods. Over 370,000 German prisoners held in United States camps experienced treatment that often exceeded their experiences as Wehrmacht soldiers. They ate better. They received medical care. They accessed educational and recreational opportunities. Many formed positive impressions of American society that influenced post-war attitudes toward democracy and international cooperation. Some former POWs later emigrated to the United States, choosing to live in a nation they'd fought against because POW experience had revealed opportunities and freedoms unavailable in war-devastated Germany. The numbers weren't massive. Immigration restrictions limited returns. But the existence of any such cases demonstrated how profoundly humane treatment could transform enemies into friends. The broader lesson endured through subsequent conflicts. Nations that treated prisoners humanely gained moral authority internationally. They encouraged enemy defections. They demonstrated that victory didn't require abandoning civilized standards. The principle was validated repeatedly, from Korean War to Cold War to modern conflicts, where treatment of detainees influenced global perceptions of legitimacy and moral standing. American POW policy and Wehrmacht succeeded not just because it was morally right, but because American industrial capacity made generous treatment affordable, because American culture valued rule of law even toward enemies, and because the policy served strategic interests through psychological effects that exceeded what conventional warfare could achieve. The weapon of decency worked when backed by economic power, consistent application, and willingness to allow truth about treatment to spread through channels enemies trusted more than official propaganda. Friedrich Müller's decision to surrender on December 3, 1944, represented rational calculation informed by verified information. He knew American camps provided survival prospects better than continued fighting. He knew because his cousin Karl had written letters describing actual conditions. That truth, spreading through Wehrmacht ranks via thousands of similar letters, contributed to Nazi Germany's collapse as soldiers chose survival over ideological loyalty to lost cause. The propaganda war was won not through deception but through simple reality that one side could afford to treat enemies humanely and allowed that fact to become weapon more effective than any bomb could be. Sometimes mercy was strategy, and sometimes strategy required nothing more than treating human beings with dignity that enemies' own regime could no longer provide.